Hello and welcome to this month's Cision webinar, What Journalists Say They Want from PR Today. My name is Cheryl Douglas and I'm Cision's Head of Media Research and Jobs, and I'll be your moderator as we explore this topic over the next 45 minutes. For Cision's 2018 State of the Media Survey, we wanted to discover what the big issues shaping the media today mean for our PR professionals. So we polled 1,355 journalists from across the globe on everything from fake news scandals to declining trust in social media, search engines bypassing traditional outlets, and much more. The webinar will explore our key findings, including what journalists say is the biggest challenge facing the media today, which sources of brand information journalists trust the most, and how PRs can build stronger relationships with key publications. We've got a lot to cover today, so it's my pleasure to introduce two speakers from different sides of the media, Jack White and Sean Allen-Moy, apologies. Jack is Celebrity Content Director for titles including Now, Women's Own, Women, and Women's Weekly. He'll give his take on this year's findings and how journalists and PRs can work together to tackle the big challenges facing the media today. Sean is an account director at W. He'll draw on his experiences working at Sky News and the BBC to consider what our findings mean in practice for our comms professionals. But first, let me run you through the key findings of this year's survey. When it comes to dealing with technological changes, it seems journalists are more concerned with what will affect them today than what might have the impact in the future. Just 7% of journalists said voice recognition technology and innovations like Amazon's Alexa would change the way they work the most. The threat of AI stealing journalists' jobs fared only slightly better, with 12% of the vote. On the other hand, 34% of journalists said changes to social media algorithms will have the greatest impact on their daily lives. And better tools for measuring performance of digital content came in highly at 21% of the vote. Just bear with me, people. For this year's survey, we wanted to build up a clear picture of what journalists think about the media and comms industries. As you can see, we heard back from a broad cross-section of media professionals, with 48% working in print journalism, 20% hailing from digital titles, and 15% specialising in broadcast media. For the second year in a row, fake news was one of the survey's key focuses. We found that the majority of journalists believe the phenomenon will make people more sceptical about what they read, but surprisingly 93% are unsure about what it means for their publication or think its impact has been neutral. Declining trust is also a burning issue for journalists, with 71% saying the public has lost trust in the media over the past year. That's down from 91% in last year's survey, but it's still a troubling statistic. With the issue of trust in the spotlight, it seems journalists' priorities are changing. Globally, 70% of respondents cited accuracy as their organisation's top priority, above exclusivity and being the first to break a story. Of course, journalism is first and foremost a public service. We recently saw the Pulitzer Prize acknowledge this by awarding its prize for public service to the New York Times and New Yorker magazine for their scoops on the sexual harassment in Hollywood and the media. Our research suggests journalists are split about the question of how these revelations affect journalism's image. 36% the coverage strongly enforced the media's role in such issues, while 29% thought it hurt journalism's image. When it comes to dealing with the technological change, it seems journalists are more concerned with what will affect them today than what might have an impact in the future. Just 7% of journalists said voice recognition technology and innovations like Amazon's Alexa would change the way they work the most. The threat of AI stealing journalists' jobs fared only slightly better, with 12% of the vote. On the other hand, 34% of journalists said changes to social media algorithms will have the greatest impact on their daily lives. And better tools for measuring performance of digital content came in highly at 21%. One thing that hasn't changed over the past year is the central role PRs play in the media landscape. 70% of journalists said their relationship with PR pros remain as important as ever, with 20% saying those relationships are now more important. When it comes to what journalists want from PR contacts, 63% said news announcements and press releases, but a further 22% said original research on trends and market data is also important to them, suggesting new opportunities for PRs to provide sources for media titles. 45% said making sure the news hook is clearly stated is the best way to improve a press release, with 44% saying press releases are the most reliable source of brand information, but only 30% said the same about company spokespeople. And despite how much time journalists spend using social media, just 3% said they trust content from blogs and social media channels. You can find many more insights to help you improve your relationships with journalists in Cision's 2018 State of the Media Report. But that's quite enough from me for now, so it's my pleasure to hand over to Jack as he gives his thoughts on how journalists and PRs can work together in 2018.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So just a little introduction on myself. I currently work at Time Inc., but before that I've worked at titles including Closer and Hello, and now I head up the celebrity team for Woman, Woman's Own Now, and Women's Weekly. So when we talk about how fake news is affecting the media, in my opinion, I think that audiences just don't believe anything anymore, and it's so much harder to keep the trust. Luckily for us, we have a long-standing relationship with our audiences, and I think brands that they can trust. But that means, especially these days, our news stories have to be immediately believable to the reader. When I'm planning content for my magazines, even if it seems slightly that the readers are going to give an eye roll and turn the page, they just don't make the cut, because you just have to be really transparent and really not sensationalized. I can't speak for everyone, but I think that the fake news phenomenon has made me much more conscious about what I put out in the magazines. Accuracy has always been important, and it always will be. You don't want to be the person that gets it wrong. I think as publications, we have a responsibility to keep up the standards readers have come to expect, and in that, accuracy is probably more important now than it ever has been. We have to make sure that our stories are not only factual, but for anyone that thinks that when it comes to celebrity news, we can just publish whatever we like, our stories, they go through lawyers first of all, and they give us a hard time, and they make sure that the story is true, and that we're not just writing whatever we like. And I think that's important, because getting it right now it's the difference between losing readers and and maintaining your circulation. I don't think circulation in many publications is ever going to rise again, but we can maintain the readers that we've got. Obviously, the Hollywood sexual harassment scandal was one of the biggest stories. Has been one of the biggest stories, and I think it's fair to say that was probably because of the media helping the scandal snowball in the way that it did, and it gave people the confidence to come forward. But in the same way, I think it also allowed some publications to use sensational headlines and clickbait, which would stop people from believing certain stories, and just it was a rise of fake news again. Excuse me. Which again increases the importance of accuracy and making sure that your readers can trust what they're getting from you. There's always going to be a risk of prejudice when it comes to reporting in crime, when it comes to crime reporting, but I think that comes down to the journalists and the publications themselves. You can't. It's a different conversation to have, I think. Algorithm changes definitely keep us on our toes. I work mainly across print, but also, of course, all of our print titles have websites, and the algorithm changes that just mean we have to try and stay one step ahead to make sure that our audience see all of our online content. It just means being a bit more creative with social media and make sure that we don't give in to the temptation of clickbait, because yeah, that might work then and now, but in the long term, the readers will stop believing you and stop coming back to your website, so it will have a negative effect. But because of this, I would say our audiences need to know that they can trust us. And our relationships with PRs are probably as important now, if not more, than they ever have been. I think we need to work together because, you know, one couldn't do the job without the other. And the way that we like to work with brands is when they are launching a new product or a brand endorsed by a celebrity. And that's why it's really important for journalists to maintain their relationships with the PRs, because we need to know what they can offer us, and we need to know that they're going to offer us correct content for our publications. But we also need to know that we can give them the coverage that they need. And it's really important to find that right balance so everyone's happy, the journalists, the PRs, and of course the audience. And the content that I like to receive, which works best for our brands, are exclusive interview opportunities, videos or images that we know aren't going to go anywhere else. Especially the celebrity journalism industry is very saturated, and we need to know that we are going to get something that our competitors haven't already got. The content that I don't like receiving from PRs is a lot of facts and figures and jargon. As with everyone in this industry, you know, time is of the essence, and we haven't got time to look through all that information before making a decision. I think that journalists and PRs, we can improve the relationship that we've got with each other. From a PR to a journalist point of view, I think that it's really important for the PR to know the market that they're pitching to. It's really important to know the brands, you know, the audience that's reading those brands, and just to get it right the first time. And that's why it's really important to build a relationship, so you know that you can keep going back to the same publication, same brand. You know what you're getting, you know what they want, you know what they can offer you. What I would say is avoid mass emails, because, you know, if I can tell that you're just sending, I'm just on a batch of 100 emails, I'm not going to be that inclined to get back to you, because I just think you probably, it hasn't been catered to our audiences. And that's, again, why it's important to build an authentic relationship. So I know when that PR comes to me, you know, we've worked together before, we know what each other wants.
Thanks very much, Jack. That's really insightful. So I'll pass on to Sean now for our PR view.
Apologies in advance, I'm going to sneeze at some stage. Just to give you a brief background, I'm Sean, I'm a Senior Account Director at W. We're an agency at a very exciting stage with over 100 staff in London, Singapore, Amsterdam and Newcastle. Prior to joining W, I was a journalist for 11 years. I joined from Sky, where I worked as a producer on Sky News, covered stories including the war in Libya, London riots, 2012 Olympics and elections in the UK and the US. I also worked as deputy editor on The Breakfast Show on Sky Sports News. And before Sky, I was a producer on the Jeremy Vine Show on Radio 2. Like many journalists and ex-journalists, I've done all sorts of jobs, from local radio journalist, reporter on Radio 1. I've read the news for Frank Skinner and made the tea for Vanessa Feltz. I work on a broad range of W's clients, offering broadcast expertise, media strategy and training, and also help lead our enterprise division, which works with ambitious businesses of all sizes. So I think just before we look at what the findings of the report mean for PR, I think just building on a lot of what Jack said, just going back to try and unpack the reasons behind the findings based on why we think journalists feel the way they do about the media today, based on our experiences with them, talking to them every day. Obviously, we saw how, again, for another year running, how big an issue fake news is. And we know that trust in major institutions has famously been on the decline for years. There's the Michael Gove quote there that everyone's had enough of experts, but also I've included Donald Trump there, and I think we sort of see it as a bit of a joke and a bit flippant, but actually I think he does have a serious impact. If the most powerful man in the world can say that he thinks CNN is fake, then so can everyone else. It gives license to people to doubt the news, and with that fake news, he's effectively created a catchphrase for any story or any piece of information that we don't really want to believe. Again, journalists that responded to the survey stressed the importance of accuracy. When people used to say in the media, probably still do actually, about Sky that the mantra is never wrong for long. It was a joke and it was unofficial, of course, but the point was it was about being first and about being there with the breaking news. And I think that's always been the case for journalists, where if you write for a magazine, you want to be there you want to be first with that interview. If you write for a newspaper, you want to have the scoop, you want to be there with the first person with the photo. But it's not the same anymore. News breaks in a tweet. If you follow football, you know that goals often go in on Twitter before you actually see them go in on the TV. And everyone tweets breaking news. There was as you can see there, the Ollie Murs tweet from Topshop, which basically caused a stampede in Oxford Street. And I think the message here is that when you're competing against every Twitter user potentially in the world, you're going to find it very difficult to win the race to be first, unless you've got something genuinely original and authentic and exciting. So I think accuracy and authority is the key here. So good news for PR people from the study is that journalists do believe there is a continuing need for PR. And I think the reasons, and as PR people we find, there are fewer journalists out there. It's more difficult to get hold of a journalist these days, but there are also more platforms, and no one does what they used to do and just puts a paper to bed. They've got a website to fill after they filed their story for a paper. They've got a live blog to update. And that's why there is that continuing need for PR announcements and press releases and data. It's content to fill those pages. And again, with the importance of the news hook, it's the same reasons really. There are fewer journalists and there are more slots to fill. But there are also more news sources, and journalists are getting bombarded with all sorts of news and information every day. So basically, it's important to spell out the news hook and make them realize why that story is important. There's a scene in The Thick of It, the political satire documentary, where the guy is the night editor. He's playing the night editor at the Daily Mail, and at one point, about 3 a.m, he just screams at the girl on the desk, "Just tell me what the news is and I'll write the news." It sometimes feels like for journalists, when they're getting bombarded with thousands of pieces of information every day, that must be what it's like. So looking at what this means from a PR perspective and what lessons we can learn from that. Obviously, fake news is a huge concern for the journalism industry and for the news industry. So what I would say is, don't try and trick a journalist. Go back to what Jack said, try and build an authentic relationship with them. Don't pass off a generic national survey story as a local story if you're speaking to local media. I have in the past freelanced or worked at radio stations where they would take a national PR study and which said 25% of UK respondents think this, and just replace UK with people in Cambridgeshire. That isn't authentic news, and we shouldn't try and trick people with it. Readers are more skeptical as ever, as we know. But as we saw, 20% of respondents say their relationships with PR are more important than ever. So don't blow it. Don't hide a brand mention. Don't pretend something's new when it isn't, and don't pretend you've got an exclusive when you haven't. Journalists now have got enough enemies and skeptics and people who don't believe what they're saying. So be honest with them, but also it's important to be honest with yourself and think before you pitch. Is what you're pitching newsworthy? Is it of interest to that publication? Would a journalist from that publication really run your story? So as we saw, 75% of journalists have cited accuracy as their top priority. So make yourself popular. You could, as a PR, get a reputation for being accurate. Know the answers to the questions they're going to ask. Don't guess them and don't make mistakes. And when you're putting together a press release or a pitch, or before you go out to speak to a journalist, think like them, interrogate your story and your release. And if you want to, it's simple really, if you want to know what a journalist will ask, then digest as much journalism as possible. If you're going to a particular journalist, then read things that they've written before, or a publication, see the sorts of things they like to cover. If you're selling stats saying that they're for the UK, then don't 2 hours later, when the journalist has written the story, say, oh, actually, by the way, they're just for England. You're only going to annoy them, and it just makes them doubt what you're saying. If you say you're offering the CEO as a spokesperson, don't then suddenly switch them out for the marketing manager. You're only going to annoy them, and they're not going to trust what you're saying. And I think the state of mind to have is, you are a stranger asking a journalist to run a story. There are loads of other strangers asking journalists to run the stories, so don't give them any reason to doubt you, because they don't want to give their readers any more reason to doubt them. So the continuing need for PR is obviously good news for us. On one hand, there are more slots, which means there are more spaces for your stories. But journalists are busier than ever. There's fewer of them. So help them out and do as much of their work for them as possible. Spell out the story. Here it is. Here's the insight. Here's the spokesperson. If you've got assets for media, then spell them out. Tell them. If they've already written a story for a website or publication on the topic that you're talking about, don't continually pester the journalist. But if you do have an additional spokesperson, some insight or some comment, offer it to them, but only if it's original and relevant and you can realistically see them running it. There may be fewer journalists than ever, but there are more PRs than ever. And the importance of the news hook, I think, comes down to the same reason, really. Journalists are busier than ever, so sell them the story and tell them why it matters. And if there's no obvious news hook, then think again and think, should you really be pitching it, and should you be pitching it to that journalist? And finally, it seems from the study that press releases, despite this multimedia age, press releases are important and do matter more than ever. There are more news sources than ever. If news is coming at journalists from Twitter, from Snapchat, from Instagram, from Facebook, then a press release that gives you a news hook, that gives you insight, that gives you a spokesperson, that gives you additional info, it's invaluable. When looking at headline or the top paragraph of a press release, the journalist should be able to visualize that story in their publication. And it goes back to what I said before, as much as you can, try and do a journalist's job for them and make their lives easier.
Thanks ever so much, Sean. Again, that's another insightful presentation. So everybody, we've got time for questions now, so please do submit them. I'm going to kick off with one for you, Jack. Why do you think so many journalists believe the public has lost trust in journalists over the past 12 months? With all the news that's what's happening, like the fake news.
I think that's exactly it. I think people are really find it hard to trust at the moment, and you've got to try and make them believe in you again, and make them realise that what you're offering them is not fake news, and they can really rely on the content you're putting out there for them. And it's something that I always think when I'm writing a story is think about your audience. Do they want to know this? Like, is this relevant to them? Are they going to believe this? You've got it. It is the fake news thing, and it's the fact that everything can be already out there on social media as well. So that people take social media with a pinch of salt as well, because so many people have access to it. You don't know if what's on that is 100% true.
And how do you think journalists can help combat that in terms of managing the social media stories and separating out the fake news and getting an audience to understand this is our content, you can trust this content?
I think it's not trying to join that race of being the first person to put it out there, because if you do that, you're risking publishing fake news. I think you need to really research your story before you put it out there. I think it's more important to put out an accurate story than be the first person to get it up.
And a question for you, Sean. If the press release is still the most trusted source of brand information, what can PRs do to make their press releases more effective today?
I think just going back to what we said in the presentation, I think if you can, as much as you can, tailor your press release or your pitch to the publication or the journalist that you're trying to get to run it, that you're pitching it to. I think that they shouldn't have to, they should be able to look at a headline, look at the top of the press release and be able to see that and see that in their publication. It should be as much as possible written in the language that their readers or viewers or listeners will understand. And also, I think this may be coming from a TV background, I don't like too much information. I don't want to have to scroll down to read more. So if I doubt journalists and busy journalists do either. So it's making that press release in the language of the publication and the journalist that you're pitching it to, but also making sure you're telling the story quickly and effectively.
That's a definite theme, and when I've been speaking to PRs and journalists, that there is that, in essence, need for speed when you get a press release. Everything's there that's clickable and all the information that they need in order to make a decision whether to use it. And we've got some great questions coming through. One says, thank you. What's the best way to pitch an idea to a journalist? In today's world, we have email, social media, call, Twitter. I mean, is there a preference, Jack, in terms of how you like to be pitched to?
For me, it's purely email. I tend to not. I think it's hard for a PR to pitch on social media because you're limited space, limited characters. I think if you do the email right, that's the way to do it. Yeah.
And as a PR, do you rely on traditional email, or is your firm moving towards a more social media pitch?
I think email is the most effective because you can get that information condensed into an email and make sure you're reaching the journalist. But what I would say, there is something to be said, and I think it goes back to what both of us said about having an authentic relationship with a journalist, whether that's having a relationship where you can send them an email, but also because you know them, they're not going to be annoyed that you've sent them a text to say, oh, I've sent you a press release, I've sent you this story, but also being able to pick up the phone to them and give them a nudge. And maybe when you have that relationship, you don't necessarily have to send them the press release. You could send them a couple of lines on an email, knowing that that's what they need, knowing exactly how to sell the story to them. So therefore, you're not the same as all the other PRs. You're not bombarding them with lots of information. I think it's about having that genuine relationship.
Thank you. And another really good question here, again for you, Jack. And this will really help the PRs as well, in terms of, have you experienced a pitch where you thought something wasn't quite right about it?
I don't think I've ever experienced a pitch where I would think, oh, I'm not sure how genuine this is, but I do get pitches quite a lot that the PR will say to me, I think this is perfect for your brand, and once I've read it, it's clear that PR hasn't ever read my brand, and that happens a lot, and it's not just a one-off. I get people coming to me with things like, oh, this would really work well on this page, but that page isn't in my magazine, it's in a competitor.
Right.
So yeah. So that's when I get things that isn't right. So on that, I would say just always make sure you're checking who you're emailing.
There's a question in Felicia Golden, and it says, how should a science company go about pitching itself as an authority commentator without pitching specific stories and press releases? Do journalists look for experts, or just use the ones they have a relationship with over time? I mean, I can comment on that in terms of, I speak to an awful lot of journalists and PRs in terms of connecting them through Cision, and what's the best way to pitch certain items. So when you're pitching commentators, you do have to, it goes back to that news hook. There needs to be a reason as to why you're going to that particular niche title, or it could be mainstream, as to why are you putting that commentator in front of that organisation, in front of that journalist? If it's a case of showcasing them, there has to be a reason, maybe a news hook of what's happening if we're talking about science here, what's happening in the industry that day or that week. Is there a story that you can say, well, my commentator can help with, he can have an authoritative voice on this. Any suggestions from you, Jack, in terms of pitching?
So I'm just going to draw on the weekend of the wedding, and I got 10 to 15 emails from people offering to comment on the dress for my titles, but they were all the same email. So we used someone we've already got a relationship with. There was nothing different to any of it. So I just think it's always trying to stand out from the crowd. It's the best way to do it.
And there's quite a few questions coming in following around how to actually tailor your email to a journalist. Things like, should you do the follow-up call? What's the best email subject line for a pitch? And they're quite difficult to answer because it does depend on the subject matter that pertaining to why you're sending it to that individual or that organisation. But quite a few people are commenting on this. So I'm going to ask the question, and journalists tend to get a bit annoyed when I ask this question, but do you like a follow-up call?
No. And I especially don't like it when it comes 2 minutes after the email's been sent.
Yeah. And in your experience, as both a previous journalist and PR, what's your view on follow-up calls? Or best way? We all know that the PR is tasked with emailing and getting in contact with certain organisations to get their news out there. And they may have to do a follow-up call. But what's your advice?
I think the follow-up call 2 minutes after you sent the press release
Yeah.
is the worst type of follow-up call. If you're confident in that the story that you are putting out is relevant for that publication, that you have something interesting to say and that it would work for them, and that if you believe in your heart of hearts, if the journalist saw that story and picked your press release or your email out of all the hundreds they've received, that they would run it, then go for it. But be friendly, be yourself, and don't be a robot on the phone. Make sure the journalist is a human as well, so make sure you're engaging in proper conversation.
And there's a couple of questions following social media, but with PR in mind. How can PR work with social media to get their story out there and connected to the right audience?
A lot of the work that we do is integrated between PR and social media. Social media is a form of media, obviously. So therefore, it's important that the same core messaging and the same news from an organisation comes via traditional media and social. What we tend to do is work as one team, but have specialists who work across traditional media and social media, because although the messaging may be the same, the language and the way you tell that story is obviously very different, whether that's in a 10-second video for social media or a longer form opinion piece for more traditional media.
And it's quite a hot topic with social media and Facebook at the moment, but really for both of you, but starting with you, Jack, how do you think Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal will affect the media in the long run?
I think what's happening already and what we're seeing is people are questioning Facebook and they're questioning everything around it. And, some people are even turning their backs on it and, just, again, not trusting and social media because of what's happened. But I think we can push past it. And I think by being really transparent with our audience on social media and by offering them only what they want from us, we can rebuild that trust again.
And then following on from a PR point of view, again with the Cambridge Analytica, do you think brands will move budget out of digital back into print media because of it?
I don't know if it's about moving it from digital to print, but I think it's about potentially moving it from sites like Facebook to places that are more, that people have less of that people can start to trust. I think this presents an opportunity. Effectively, Facebook, without anyone paying much attention, basically became the biggest news source in the world. Most people, I think there's a stat that most people in America consume their news from Facebook. Obviously, we've seen now that wasn't 100% transparent, and that data was used for purposes they weren't massively keen on. So I think for traditional media, but also for digital media from brands that are exerting authentic editorial control, it's an opportunity for them. It's an opportunity to build their credibility as a news source and fight back. People, I think, realise now that what they're consuming on Facebook isn't necessarily the headlines of that day. It might not be specifically tailored to what they need. On a lot of occasions, they've been told what they wanted to hear. Now that people realise that, it's an opportunity for other organisations to fill that void and claw back some of that readership.
Thank you. And we've had a couple of questions in about authentic relationships with journalists, and you picked up on how to have an authentic relationship on your presentation. So, Jack, how can a PR create a really good working relationship with the journalist industry today, considering the amount of press releases coming in from all different channels?
There are obviously a few ways, but when contacting them in the first instance on email, it's making it really clear that they know your brand and that what they're offering you is something that you're going to be interested in, and it's going to make your job easier. And when you follow up with the phone calls, it's making it clear that, like, you're not just calling them because they're on a list, that they're calling you because they want what they are promoting in your magazine, and they know why. And it's coming back to them every time they've got something that they're working on that's going to work for your titles. They come back to you. It's like, I see PRs that I've got a good relationship with. They're extended colleagues, you know. So if I need something that I think a certain PR is working on, and I can give them a call, and if they need to get something in a publication, they can give me a call, because we can work together well.
Yeah. And there's some great questions coming through. There's one about the local media. I'm going to aim this one at you, Sean, because you've had experience in this area, and Jack, jump in afterwards. So if your story isn't exciting and you're targeting local media as it's relevant to the area, is there a best practice way to sell these in?
I think it's making it clear that it is a genuinely local story and it is relevant to that area, and not dressing up a national story as a local story is key, because they'll get bombarded with a lot of that. They'll get bombarded with a lot of surveys where people have, as I say, crowbarred in a regional angle. If it is a genuine local story, I would say that, be very explicit about that. But also, one thing I always used to find about PR people ringing local media when I worked in local media was they tended to be a bit sniffy about it. This is for local media. You've got an opportunity. You've got a really good story with strong assets to get a bigger piece of coverage, and that coverage may end up being more effective than a national piece of coverage. So be enthusiastic about it, sell it to them, and make it clear that you know how important it is, because they may only have a small amount of space to fill on their radio program or in their newspaper. So they can actually afford to exert editorial control and be picky about what they run. So don't take regional and local media for granted.
Thank you. And there's a couple of questions around the importance of accuracy in PR and journalist relationships. But there's a really good one here about what about the audience? The distrust in the media in general is growing, and fake news, like we've been discussing today, is continuing to spread. Do you think that at some point we'll need, when a story is going out to print on blogs or social media, we'll need a kind of certification, so a label of authenticity?
I think our label of authenticity is our long-standing brand that readers can hopefully trust in, and I just think by continuously being someone who isn't putting out fake news, I think that's how you build up a label of authenticity.
Yeah. And I've just got a couple more questions before we wrap up for today. What sort of research tends to get the best earned media pickup, do you think? And how in-depth should this research be? I'm going to throw that over to both of you. So in your PR capacity, how would you package that up to a journalist in terms of making sure it gets the best reach?
In terms of research and data,
yeah.
I think it's about making sure that you're honest about your sample size and the people you've asked, and not just going with 1 in 10 when you've actually only spoken to 10 people. I think it's about being explicit like that. Jack, you probably get a lot of this all the time. And I guess from my own point of view as a journalist, I always looked at, hang on, is this an authentic piece of research? Who's carried it out? Who's the brand behind it? Are they trying to hide the brand?
Yeah.
And does it have any do they have any relevance, and do they have any authority to be publishing research on that?
Absolutely, yeah. Totally agree with that.
That's what you think as well, yeah?
Yeah.
And then I've got quite a big question for both of you, is What do you think would be the big challenges for media and journalism over the next 12 months?
I'm gonna go first.
Yeah.
I think we know the answer to that because it was from it's come through your survey today. I think the threat of fake news, the dwindling sizes of newsrooms and resources, and I think that has an effect on journalists, it has an effect on PRs. I think it means that standards need to be higher to earn the public's trust. PRs need to win journalists' trust. And I think fake news and skepticism about news is endemic and isn't going to go away anytime soon.
And I would say it's just about maintaining high levels of editorial standards and keeping them there, and not rushing to be the first person to get a story out. Don't be the first person to get it out. Be the person to get it out correctly.
And also, just coming on to what the survey's called out on algorithms within social media and how that's changing at quite a rapid rate, I think. So how does that affect the publications, the social media aspect with you in terms of how you push a story out, how you get, how you know it's doing well?
So the algorithm changes on Facebook or just
in general?
It is hard because with them, they're continually changing, and you've got to try and stay one step ahead of what they're going to do next. How is it going to change next? It just means we have to be really creative with social media, and not worry when things change. Just think, okay, this is happening now. This is how we're going to get around that, and just going with it.
And what about PR in terms of using the data you get back from social algorithms and how that affects how you're getting your stories out? Do you push your stories out via social media without journalists, or it's always with the media in mind?
It depends what the story is and depends who you're targeting, I think. But to ignore those sort of changes in algorithms, I think that it's so fundamental, social media, in the way that people consume news information, you'd be foolish not to take it into account.
And just a couple more questions. We've got a few on coming back to pitching to journalists, but do you still like going out for coffee?
Yeah, it's always great to put a face to a name. Obviously everyone's so busy these days that you've probably got to get it in the diary a few weeks in advance. But I don't see the harm in making an actual relationship with someone. It just means that when the email comes through, you're like, oh, I actually know who that person is, so I'm actually going to read it.
Yeah. And how when you're out in the PR world, how difficult are you finding it going out there and making those relationships on a face-to-face basis?
I think having that, as I think we've both said throughout, having that authentic relationship is so important and does make such a difference. I think that it's harder than ever to get a journalist out of the office just because workloads are so high and resources are so scarce. But what I would say is, and we do a lot of this at our agency and try and build those authentic relationships, is speak to the right journalist and make it, and it's a two-way thing. So if you are speaking to if you have a number of, for example, health clients, and you're going to speak to the health editor at publication, it is going to be beneficial to them. So make sure you spell out what you're offering them.
And then I think one of our last questions, and it's aimed at the PR world, what is the biggest threat for PRs to be aware of?
Well, I think it goes back to what the biggest threat to the media is, and it's skepticism, it's fake news. And I think as consumers are more wary and skeptical and cynical about the news, then journalists effectively have to be. So what we need to do as PRs is set the standards high, make sure what we're selling into journalists is accurate and that it's suitable for their publication, and that we've put some genuine thought into it.
Thank you. Any last comments, Jack, on relationships between PRs and journalists in terms of how they can make better connections?
I think it's doing everything that we've said. So it's strong, simple, strong pitches to the correct brand, and where you can get a face-to-face meeting in so you can build a relationship.
Thank you. Sean, Jack, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day today. That's all we have time for, everybody. Do keep an eye out for the next Cision webinar on gorkana.com. And don't forget you can download your copy of the Cision 2018 State of the Media Report from the white papers and digest section of the site. So again, thank you so much for attending today. And for our audience as well, some really great questions have come through. Thank you. We hope to see you again.